Okay, so here is our video lecture on population dynamics. And we're going to start with the idea of what the word dynamic really means. So to be dynamic is to always be changing or to change. And as conservation biologists, the things that we are looking at are how populations differ in distribution, numbers, and age structure. Those are at least the three most important characteristics that we need to learn about. So distribution being where are they located, how are they located? Numbers, so we're looking at those population estimates. We had the lab on the goldfish and the lab on the meadow with the sunflowers, where we were seeing how conservation biologists would go about estimating population sizes. And then we also have age structure, so looking at how the population is broken up in terms of pre-reproductive, reproductive, and post-reproductive ages. We're going to look a lot more at that one when we go into the next unit and look at human populations, but we will see it a little bit in today's lecture as well. Okay, so populations, why they're going to change. One of the things that we look at is temperature, and this is something that we can tie back to our eco columns, because we know, for example, that we chose a betta fish. Obviously they can't migrate, but we chose betta fish because it is going to survive at room temperature waters. If you've ever had an aquarium at home, you know that you have to put a heating element in that aquarium, because most of the time what we have is tropical fish, and tropical fish need tropical temperatures. So we know that animals have preferences, and that goes back to that idea of range of tolerance and optimal population abiotic factors. So when you're hitting that range of tolerance right in the sweet spot, you're going to do a lot better, whether they're plants or whether they're animals. So one of the things that we do know as well is that with climate change, we even see plant populations, even tree populations are starting to migrate. So we think about it with things like birds, and maybe they're spending more of their time in northern climates because, again, climate change. So it's going to be warmer, longer in their range. It's going to be a little bit better off it being slightly shifted to the north or to the south if you were in the southern hemisphere. But we even know that with plants, what we see is their seeds are tending to germinate, to sprout, to do better, again, on those polar ends of their temperate ranges. And so temperature will have an effect on where plants and animals, and so any organism, would be. Presence of disease organisms or harmful chemicals. The really famous case out in the east is Dutch elm disease. So it's a disease that is affecting trees. And where that disease comes in and takes hold, then we see a decimation of that forest population. We have other invasive species, like there's certain beetle species that have come over from Asia. And again, when we see that, it has a detrimental effect on tree species. So when disease organisms come in, or maybe it's chemicals, maybe we're talking about acid rain, which is again a big issue out here in the east. So that will have an effect on populations. We could talk about resource availability. One of the things I discussed in one of the classes was a population of horses off the coast of Georgia on an island called Cumberland Island. A lot like what you guys have here off the coast of Maryland, but these horses were brought by the Vanderbilt family back before the Depression. They had a fantastic little resort island for themselves, and they had brought over horses. Well, when the Depression hit, they stopped being able to take care of their property. They stopped using it. It fell into disrepair. Right now it's ruins. But the land was donated to the Park Service, and the Park Service continued to bring over hay to feed the horses. And so we continued to have a population of breeding horses on Cumberland Island in Georgia. Well, when the Fish and Wildlife Service decided that that wasn't something that they were going to continue to do because it goes against nature's carrying capacity, they withdrew that resource, and the population of horses has dwindled because of that. So resource availability. And then you have the arrival and disappearance of competing species. So goes back again to our native and non-native discussion. When we have something new come in, it competes. If it is going to outcompete, we know from Gauss's law from resource partitioning, No two species can survive for very long in the same niche. They adapt, move, or die. So again, these are things that are going to cause those changes. If they move, then that's a change in distribution. If they die, that's a change in population. So some of the different ways that we can be dispersed is through clumped populations, uniform dispersion, and random populations. I like the pictures that the book has here. The Miller textbook actually has some different pictures. So I kind of talk a little bit about some different animals that would have these, and plants that would have these particular patterns. So I'm going to start not with clumping. Clumping is about the easiest one, but I'll go ahead and start down here with uniform. So in our picture of uniform dispersion, and on your notes, you're just drawing these dots in the box to show what uniform would look like. And what we see is that there's roughly the same amount of area around every little dot. The penguins are a great example because what they will do is kind of have a territory. So when we look at them, even though, yeah, technically there's not exactly the same number of centimeters between each one, but at the same time, you can see that everybody wants to be at least like a fin length away from, a wing length away from the next penguin. So they're having their own personal territories. Where we see uniform also is if you think about a lot of plant species. If you go into a pine forest, you'll see that the pine trees have a certain territory. There's a region around the trees, the main part, why am I faltering on this word? There's a region around the trunk of the tree where we could say there's a radius that other trees don't want to grow in. And with a pine tree, there's a couple different reasons. Number one is those leaves fall and they have some pretty potent tannins in them, and they're going to keep other seedlings from sprouting. But the other thing to think about too is what's going on under the surface for plants. They have a root structure that spreads out. And so as that root structure spreads out, it's going to also take up resources and prohibit new growth from coming in because it won't be able to compete with those bigger, deeper, wider roots. So again, we see this a lot in plants. The random dispersion is also really, really common in plants. And I like to think about a dandelion where you blow the little seed pods and they just float on the wind and they can land anywhere. So in the spring, you've got dandelions in your yard. Some of them might be clumped together. Some of them might be off all alone. There's really no rhyme or reason. So random is exactly what it sounds like. And the other one, the most common, is clumped. So in the next slide, we're going to talk about reasons why a population might clump. But the thing to keep in mind here, how do you know what an organism is doing? Things that clump, we have terms for. For example, this is a school of fish. I think another example, is letting people in class call out. So you can think for a second, what do I call it when I have a big group of geese? What do I call it when I have a big group of seagulls? So, a flock of seagulls, haha, because I like the 1980s. Crows, you can have a murder of crows. You have a herd of cattle, or you have a herd of elephants. So anytime we've got those grouping words, and there are tons of them, some of them are pretty crazy. Anytime we have those words about a group, well, that's a clumped distribution pattern. It's interesting, too, to think about some animals within the same family that have different, by species, have a different distribution. For example, lions have prides, but tigers are more uniform. They have territories. When you look at a clumped distribution pattern, I do want you guys to realize that sometimes you can have loners. So again, thinking about the lion population, you have the pride, but then we know too that a adolescent getting into adulthood male will be kicked out of that pride and he might have to make it on his own or join a new pride. So yes, sometimes you do have some variability here, but for the most part, animals are clumping together. You do have it in plants too, but I wanted to mention especially animals because on our next slide, we've got a reason why organisms would clump, and most of these we can easily see the applications with animals. So species will clump because they go where resources are available. I think of the scene in The Lion King when they're all down at the watering hole and everybody is getting along. You got the, the ostriches, and you have the giraffes, and you have the alligators, and they're all singing and dancing because it is Lion King. But Again, they cluster where there is a resource available. Another thing, groups have better chance of finding clumped resources. If you think of a search party, if you've lost something on the football field, it's gonna be a lot easier to find if you go out in a group with all of your friends. So if we are looking for any resource, it's much, much easier when we have a whole team and that team can communicate. So then I think of things like little ants, and we know that they send out little search ant parties, and then they communicate back where that has been found through chemical trails. Protection from predators. I love the picture here. The reason I picked it, the picture of zebras, is we know that they are using those stripes as camouflage, but it's not as obvious when you see a zebra all alone that what the camouflage is for. But when we look at them all together, it's hard to pick out each individual zebra. So this makes them more likely to survive individually. It makes them more likely to survive an attack from a predator than if they were out by themselves. Packs also allow some older or younger or injured organisms to get prey. So if we're thinking from the predator perspective, and you're in a pack, maybe you're an old lioness, but because you're still with your group, they're going to make sure that you are getting enough resources to survive. And again, the same thing with the very young. Then temporary groups can form sometimes for mating or caring for young. So maybe they're not always going to be together, but in certain seasons, in mating season, they might come together. Or as we see with the elephants here, they're all gathered around the matriarchal society, so all the females are gathered around protecting the one young, so that, again, case-selected species, we want to make sure that that one species is doing really, really well. Okay, so when we look at the size of a population, we're concerned with 4 basic things, and really, you break it down. We're concerned with who's in and who's out. So the equation for population change is the in, birth, plus immigration, minus the outs, death and exit migration. So there you've got your 4 things that we're looking at. And again, this is going to come up a lot more in the next unit. So if you've taken AP Human Geo, we are going to be looking at those equations for population change. And we're going to throw in the rates, birth rates, death rates, things like that, instead of just saying births and deaths. So this will get a little bit more complicated in the next unit. And that's really when we're going to start working with the equation. But for now, we need to know that populations change. And it's more important in this unit that we understand how to estimate those populations. And so that was the basis for the lab. And then here we're looking at the age structure. So when we have a population that is fairly young, what we know, and so let's look at the bobwhite quail here. What we know from this population is, first off, we can tell they don't live very long. We can tell the average lifespan is, 1 to 2 years. And then we can also tell about their male-female ratio. So it's about half and half male to female. And we can look and see that we have a lot of young quails and not too many making it into the 2-year span. So what this shows us is our reproductive potential. So probably because this is only a 2-year lifespan, these are going to be our reproducers. So our quail population will continue to keep up. I don't want to say it's going to grow or shrink because I don't know enough about a population of quails. If I look down here at the deer, the first thing that I really notice is this line has shifted. So what we know is that there are far more females born than there are males. The bottom of the pyramid is always your youngest. So it's interesting because we're not a 50-50 ratio. Humans are close to that. But this makes sense in the animal kingdom, especially when you have smaller clutch sizes. So the quail is going to have, probably 4 or 5 eggs, but your deer, maybe you're going to give birth to 1, possibly 2 deer. So in order to grow your population, you need lots of females compared to your males. Okay, so starting off with that, it's interesting. But what we really want to look at is, where is my population in terms of age? Because if I've got a lot in the 1-year category, they might not be able to reproduce yet. My 2s and 3s, that's probably where the bulk of reproduction is happening. And so as I'm thinking about, is my population okay, or do I need to be worried about conservation? This is something to look at. I've got my picture over here of my giant tortoise. And you can even see a little tiny baby tortoise. So this is something that we worry about with the Galapagos Islands. So you have multiple different giant tortoise species on different islands, and we worry that they have gotten so old that they would be up towards the top. They would be in the post-reproductive age. And if that happens, it doesn't matter how many tortoises you have. If they are too old to reproduce, your senior center is not giving you any babies in the nursery. So we would be worried about that population. Even though the numbers might be high, its capacity to grow might not be. So again, something else to keep in mind. Okay, when we talk about that growth of a population, we are really worried about its intrinsic growth rate. And that's represented by the letter R, the little letter R. So intrinsic growth rate, biotic potential, how fast can you grow? Just like in math class, okay? Letter R means rate. The individuals that we call R-selected species are going to have reproduction very early in their life. They will have short generation times. They can reproduce many times. As opposed to the examples I always like to give is, we talk about something that reproduces early in life. I usually tell the story about my baby rabbit that I had received as a gift in college. Never give somebody a rabbit as a gift. But anyway, it played with a friend that told me her rabbit was a female. It wasn't. 30 seconds of playing together, and 30 days later, my baby bunny had baby bunnies. So it shocked me, first off, that it reproduced when it was so young. It had, as a very young rabbit, it had 3 baby bunnies. They were adorable, but that's something, that goes along with this high biotic potential. So good examples are roaches, rodents, and rabbits. If we think about they can reproduce many times, if that rabbit has a 30-day gestation period, and then it's going to give minor care to its young. It's not going to have, like humans, it's not going to stick around with those babies for forever. So we're talking about every couple months that baby rabbit could have more rabbits. Very different than humans. We're typically, we're going to throw all caution to the wind because we're talking about basic biology here. So let's say that humans are going to reproduce just like any other animal. You're still pushing the limits with typically you see no more than 5 to 7 pregnancies. Now there are obviously people like the Duggars, but that's not typical. So if we think about back in the day when people were on the farms, we still weren't reproducing at super high rates. And again, having many offspring each time they reproduce. So we talked about roaches before. There's a nice picture of all of those. Okay, baby bunnies, they're adorable. Okay, populations also can be K-selected species. That big K, remember, stands for carrying capacity. And so when we looked at that before, we said the carrying capacity is how many individuals can be sustained in an ecosystem. If you go above that number, the population will crash. So what we see with a K-selected species is that S-shaped growth curve. As they approach the carrying capacity, the population growth tends to taper off. So we use K-selected species to indicate that the species will tend to start to limit its own growth when you are short of something like light, water, space, nutrients. So again, we're looking at limiting factors. It feels, at least, and appears like R-selected species don't care. Roaches don't care if they're about to run out of space, they're still going to reproduce. But a K-selected species, there is going to be sort of, if not a actual mental awareness, a physiological awareness that resources are running low, my body fat is low. So some animals simply can't reproduce when that happens. Another one listed up there, exposure to too many competitors, predators, or infectious disease. So again, those things are going to limit a K-selected species. Their population does not grow indefinitely at exponential rates. Okay, so here I wrote a little note. You need to go over to the bottom of the right column to continue this. It's kind of a little bit out of order on your notes, but these are some characteristics just to write down. So we already discussed them, but I wanted to give you guys a minute to get those written down. Okay, so R-selected reproduce early, short generations, can reproduce many times, and many offspring. As the K-selected species give parental care to their young, they reproduce late in life with fewer and larger offspring. They have fairly stable population sizes. They're not going to do the boom and bust, the crash cycle that we get with R-selected. And we tend to get more of the specialist species here. I did put a picture of a plant on each one of these. So you've got the dandelion on the left with the R-selected, and you have the saguaro cactus over here as a K-selected species. One of the really interesting things about saguaros is that they don't get arms and flowers until they're 70 years old. And so the flower part, obviously the reproductive part, means that a saguaro cactus can't have a baby saguaro seed until it is much older than any other plant. The other interesting thing because of that is there's actually a criminal trade in saguaro cactuses because hotels and things want these big, beautiful cacti, and they just simply don't grow fast and they don't grow often. And so there is a kind of like a illegal trafficking of saguaros. So if you need to pause it here to write some of these things down, you can. I know it was also a question of the day. And here's just, again, this is straight from the Miller textbook, but I already hit some of them. I do want to point out, you see generalists, specialists, you see things like, we'll talk about the survivorship curves a little bit later. Not everything is going to be definitively on the left or the right side. We do have some muddy waters occasionally where we are saying like over here tends to be small adults. Well, that's not always 100% of the time going to be the case. You could also be a sea turtle. And with a sea turtle, you've got lots and lots. You've got hundreds of eggs that you lay, but you're a really large adult. So sometimes it is hard to place an organism in the category. I always go with R-selected species. The best examples are roaches, rodents, rabbits. I keep those R's together. And then on K-selected bacteria, though, definitely over here. And then K-selected species, we just tend to think of our large mammals, and that will really do the trick for you most of the time. What is going to be a more common question is understanding whether the strategy, whether these characteristics would be indicative of R or indicative of K. Do they indicate a species that grows with a high biotic potential, or do they indicate a species that grows more logistically, stabling out? So that's more of the important factor. And again, here we've got our showing our growth curve. And remember that every species starts out with exponential growth when there is no limits on the resources. But it's as we approach that carrying capacity that the K species will tend to taper off. Okay. One of the things to keep in mind then is if you are looking at a graph of population size, here's the different pieces to keep in mind. I think on your paper you only are defining environmental resistance, if I'm correct. But environmental resistance is kind of the hardest part for students to remember. So environmental resistance, we see these arrows pointing down, and that's pointing at the carrying capacity. Environmental resistance, another way to think of that is limiting factors. So what are we running up against? Are we running up against a deficit of light? Are we running up against the limits of our food supply? What things are out there keeping our population in check? Maybe it's predators, maybe it is disease. Over here, you've got the biotic potential portion. So again, every species, when it does not have limits through environmental resistance, will grow exponentially. We're going to just absolutely take our resources and reproduce. But a K-selected species will start to stabilize. What you see with this species is it is fluctuating above and below, so it doesn't always look like the perfect S shape like we had here that stays just underneath. That tends to happen more with larger animals with longer gestations, but when you have shorter gestations, maybe all of the deer had babies and they didn't quite realize that they were going to run out of resources come spring. And so then you have a little bit of a die-off and then an increase and then a down again. So if you're asked to find carrying capacity on a graph, it might look like this, and carrying capacity is going to be just slightly above where it levels off, or it might look like this, and carrying capacity is going to be a line that shoots horizontally through those peaks and valleys that come after the biotic growth, the exponential growth. So again, we hit carrying capacity. We talked about exponential growth being this portion, and the logistic growth is here where it's stabilizing. Again, not a perfect mathematical model, but it does resemble what we would see with a logistic growth curve. Okay, so carrying capacities, one thing to keep in mind, they're not fixed. We saw on the last slide that you have environmental resistance. So if a disease comes in, you're going to drop your carrying capacity. If somebody from the Fish and Wildlife Service starts throwing hay, the population might increase. So when you have damage, like a flood, some sort of volcano, something that's going to restart succession, damage may reduce the area's carrying capacity. So again, just keep in mind, it's not always fixed. And I mentioned this a minute ago, you also have reproductive lag time. So that's where, for example, the deer might all get pregnant in the fall, and then in the spring when they're born, if all of them have babies, then they might overshoot their population. And so that reproductive lag time, especially in animals that go through breeding seasons, they just might have had too many and exceed the carrying capacity. So the period, again, what that means is the period from the time of the birth until the death. So there's like a lag there where they were going to exceed carrying capacity. Didn't say that as well as it's written. Another example, this is a real example of sheep on Tasmania from 1800 to 1925. And so you can see when they were first introduced, there's no limit to their growth, and so they shoot up exponentially. But then they overshoot their carrying capacity, and so then they're going to face a dieback, and then there's going to be another increase. And so again, we keep seeing this, but you do see a stabilization. So over time, animals tend toward their carrying capacity if there is limited resource growth or resource availability. This is another one. This one was kind of funny because you overshot so dramatically that then the crash is really dramatic too, and the population here just never quite recovers. I think we're going to do a special case study towards the end where we're going to look a little bit more specifically at some of our boom bust cycles, and especially what I think we're going to look at the moose of Isle Royale. This again is reindeer, but wanted to show you guys that not all graphs look the same. This one super exceeded its carrying capacity. Okay, we've talked a lot about biotic and abiotic factors when we talk about our ecocolumns, and so make sure that we talk about limiting factors. The single factor that can limit the growth, abundance, or distribution of a population in an ecosystem. So maybe it's food, maybe it is sunlight. Limiting factor principle. It's long and winded, but really it just says that when one thing is missing that's needed for your species to survive, even if it's just one thing missing, you're not going to have success. So the example that we can use using our fish, we could say, for example, that you guys are taking your readings and your pH and your nitrate and your nitrite, and everything is absolutely fabulous. And you put your fish in and you know that he's got all of the factors going for him, except he doesn't have any food. Well, he's gonna die. That's just not an okay thing. Or maybe you are giving him food, but the pH of the water is 2. That one factor will limit his growth. So that's all the limiting factor says, is that if there is one thing missing, that's enough to kill off the population. Okay, then we get into range of tolerance. And the two things kind of go together. It depends on what we're talking about as being the limiting factor. But this is also a great one to use with our eco column. So as we see the graph here of abundance of organisms, because population is on the left, on the bottom, they're showing us an example with temperature, but we can think of it as anything. We can think about it, it's really any, abiotic thing. So for example, here we have temperature. So for this fish, the optimal temperature range, let's say it's between 60 and 70 degrees. So between 60 and 70 degrees, the fish are super happy and they're reproducing and everybody is thriving. But if we go beyond that, so just for my principles, we're just going to keep it easy numbers. Let's say we go 5 degrees beneath that. So let's say this is 55 to 60, and this is 70 to 75. This is the zone of physiological stress. So can my fish survive? Yeah, absolutely. But he's a little bit stressed out. Maybe he's not eating as well. Maybe he's not able to reproduce. So these are some problems that might limit my population. So I have the most abundance right here where I have the optimal range. I can perhaps survive out here, but once I get below this number, so what did I say? This was 60, 55. So let's say that this is below 55. I've got the zone of intolerance. Maybe he can live there for like a couple hours, or maybe it's so cold that he's going to die. So this goes on both sides, both extremes. Now, different organisms, it'll look different for different factors. So maybe you have an organism that really can't ever get too hot or too cold, because maybe they'll go into stasis if they get cold. But it basically gives you that idea that we do have an optimal range. So when we're talking about, for example, our pH, I want to know what's the best pH for your beta, but you can't keep it exactly in the center. It's going to fluctuate, and we're going to be okay with that as long as we don't get into our zone of intolerance. We don't want to stay in physiological stress, but we can be there if we get a reading there. It's going to be okay for short term. So again, when we take our readings, that's something that's super important for you guys to know with your eco columns. What is the optimal range and what's the range of tolerance? Okay, so when our populations vary, they can vary because of things that are density dependent, meaning that I have a large population and I am more at risk. For example, predation, parasitism, infectious diseases, and competition. So the more deer I have, the more deer ticks I have. The more deer I have, the more likely the wolves are to move in. Obviously not here, but maybe in Wyoming. The density independent population controls, it doesn't matter how big my population is. A flood is going to flood. It doesn't matter if there's 500 deer or 5 deer. Those things happen. So the density independent things, the wildfires, basically any natural disaster, those are density independent. It does not matter how many individuals we have. Okay, then we're going to start winding down here. We've got different types of population changes that are categorized. So these are like if we're looking at a graph, these are things that typically could happen. Maybe we have a stable population, and that makes perfect sense. You can visualize a graph in your head that's stable. The end of the logistic growth curve is a stable population. Even some of those that we saw that had minor ups and downs, that's still considered to be very stable. Okay, I'm going to skip over eruptive for a second and skip down to cyclic fluctuations or boom-bust. Boom-bust cycles are our typical predator-prey relationships, where if I have a lot of deer, I'm going to go back to deer and wolves again. If I have a lot of deer, then the next year I'm probably going to have an increase in my wolf population because there was a hearty number for them to eat. So they probably ate well and they reproduced well and they were, big and fat through the winter, so they were having a good time. If there get to be too many wolves, then my deer population is going to be hunted to the point where their numbers fall. And if my deer population falls, then pretty soon after, my wolf population is going to fall. So we see this with predator-prey because the two are so dependent on one another. So I'm going to go here, a picture that is in the Miller textbook of a hare lynx. So you can see the bobcatty guy is the Canadian lynx, and then the little rabbit, of course, is hare. And so what we see with their population is that they are fluctuating and pretty much in lockstep. The big debate among ecologists is this top down or bottom up? And honestly, it doesn't matter because it depends on where we're looking at the graph as to whether we think that the predator is controlling the prey population or vice versa. So again, it's not really that important, but when you see the top down, bottom up, we're talking about is the predator controlling or is the prey controlling the growth? Okay, so now I'm left with eruptive and irregular, the two that are going to give people sort of the most pause. I'm gonna go with eruptive because I think the words, again, generally in ecology, I think the words mean what we think that they're gonna mean. Eruptive, you think of the word eruption. And so a great example here, so let me backtrack. It's a population that is going to boom and bust, but at regular intervals. So the example I want to give you guys is cicadas. And I know I'm going to mess up my years on these, but I know that there are 7-year cicadas, and then I think there's 13-year cicadas, and then there might even be like 30-year cicadas. And there are also yearly cicadas. So we have some cicadas, those big insects that make all the noise in the summer. And some of them go through cycles where they have their reproductive cycle and the new cicada comes out the very next year. But there's some of them that go 7 years between eruptions, between population booms. And so that population goes dormant for 7 years and then it erupts again. So even though it's eruptive with an I think of it like that. We can predict them. That's the big thing here is eruptive populations. We pretty much know enough now that we can say, hey, this is going to be this 30-year cicada year. And oh, by the way, this year we've got the 13 matching up with the 7, so we're going to have a whole lot of cicadas for that reason. So eruptive, we do see a huge boom, but we've got really predictable reasons why. And then irregular is simply irregular. It's kind of the hardest one. If you're asked a question about irregular, it's kind of the hardest one to say, like, ooh, I definitely think this is irregular. It's kind of the last one out. So you can see stable easily. We can see boom and bust easily. Eruptive looks kind of funny, but you can usually track it. And then irregular is the leftover. Humans aren't exempt from population controls. So here's just an example. You've got the potato famine. You have bubonic plague. We have the Spanish flu of 1918. That one's not up here, but it's more deadly. And then right now, or this isn't quite up to date, but we do know that some of our biggest killers as far as diseases go, we've got things like malaria, tuberculosis, and measles up there on the list. So these are diseases. They are density-dependent population controls, any way you look at it. Ask anybody who's an infectious disease agent, and they're going to say that viruses are the #1 concern that they have for us. Okay, white-tailed deer. I don't think that you're writing anything down about this, but you guys know we've got tons of them. Mostly because we took away their predators, and they are pretty good generalists, and then we put laws in place to protect the deer. That was great, but now we probably have too many deer, and they carry Lyme disease, there's vehicle accidents, of course there's the nuisance factor too of the eating your garden plants and shrubs, although I'm new to Maryland, so I think they're adorbs. But we do know that we need other ways to control the deer population. It's not good to have them overrun the ecosystem, because there are other organisms in the ecosystem who need to thrive as well. So again, the book goes into a whole case study on that, but I do think it's good to talk about in this unit, because we are seeing the need for predator-prey controls. We are seeing that we have density-dependent things like parasites that come in, and Lyme disease obviously affects us as well. Okay, last thing is talking about survivorship curves, and this ties back into our R and K selected species. So when we talk about survivorship, and this is probably something to throw back onto your Venn diagram if you didn't have this on there before. And so when we're talking about survivorship, what we're looking at is at what age is a population likely to survive until? We will bring this up again in the human next unit. A lot of times insurance agencies are going to look at this and basically decide what your life insurance premium should be based on how old are you. If you're getting up there in years, your life insurance is going to cost a lot more because it's more likely they're going to have to pay out. So here's the different types of survivorship. Type 1 is where individuals survive very well in early life and then live a long time, and we tend to see the deaths clustered in the end years. This is very evident in humans, right? So pretty much you don't hear very often, thankfully, about young people dying. We don't hear that often about people in their 20s or 30s or 40s, but we start to get to the 50s, 60s, yeah. And then once we're in the 70s and 80s, we kind of are like, yeah, they, not totally unexpected that person died. Get into your 90s or 100s and you're like, dang, I mean, way to go, man, right? Okay, type 3, I'm skipping down to type 3. Type 3, you have a low chance of surviving as a young, or we can even think below that, like I go back to Finding Nemo in the beginning stage and all those eggs and the barracuda gets them all except for the little flipper injured guy who ends up being Nemo. So type 3, that's pretty common. You're not very likely to make it, but if you do, you will probably live to be older. Another great example of this is our sea turtles. So again, hundreds of eggs. We know that when they hatch, they start getting picked off on their way to the ocean. If they make it to the ocean, they're still pretty soft and pretty vulnerable. But if they can make it to be 2-3 years old, heck, if they make it to be 10, they're solid, they're golden. Solid, literally, haha. But they're good to go. And they're going to live a long, long time. And then type 3 are individuals where it's pretty constant. There's no real thing that's a huge risk early, middle, or late life. So they kind of just have this decreasing population. So when we look here, this is the last slide I've got for you guys. I've got type 1 is obviously you're seeing that human growth again. Most of our case-selected species, especially mammals, case-selected mammals, we're looking at this type of growth. Then down here, they show a tree. This is where I was talking about sea turtles or Nemo. And then this one in the middle. So type 2, again, lizards are great examples. Birds, songbirds at least, not so much birds of prey. This makes me laugh because that looks like a duck and that looks like a hawk. But anyway, think about a bird. When it's an egg, maybe it gets kicked out of the nest because remember we talked about nest parasites in the cowbirds. Maybe it falls out of the nest when it's a little bit older. Maybe a cat gets it. Maybe it flies into my window and breaks its neck. Maybe it gets hit by a car. Maybe it finally starts to die of old age. So with type 2, there's really no rhyme or reason to what one day will bring. They have an equal chance of death all along if you want to be morbid about it. Again, type 1, if you want to try to remember these, because they are pretty easy, type 1, type 2, type 3, they just go down the graph. The way I remember is, we're number 1. So type 1, humans, we're number 1, yay. But type 1, type 2, and type 3. My animations don't work on this, so I can't show you guys that one. So that brings us to the end of the lecture.